Everybody, welcome. And I'm Juliette Johnson. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science at McGill, and it is my great honor and pleasure to be the MC for today's event, where we're honoring, celebrating T.V. Paul's new book, Restraining Great Powers. So, what's happening today? We're going to have 4 people saying hopefully complimentary things about T.V. Paul in the book, I would imagine so. Then we'll have Dean Antonio Maioni introduce Professor Paul, and he will make some responses, after which we will all have a little bit of wine, a little bit of cheese, some more samosas. So, it is my pleasure to introduce, as the first speaker for this evening, John Hall, who's the James McGill Professor of Sociology at McGill and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. John, the floor is yours.
Well, first thing to say is it's a great pleasure to be here. I've known T.V. Paul for many years. And I've learned a great deal from him. Asymmetric balancing, non-use of nuclear weapons, book on India, book on Pakistan, a rather marvelous book on globalization and national security state. All these things are part of my mental furniture, and to have another one is just a delight. The book itself is really simple in a certain sense. It starts off with a puzzle. T.V. Paul likes puzzles. Why not very much hard balancing in recent years? And the book is about soft balancing. I like very much as a sociologist, but he tries to explain the conditions under which different types of balancing work. He knows that nuclear weapons means that hard balancing is much riskier. He thinks there are more institutions that can be used for soft balancing. He thinks the number of radical states have gone down. And globalization makes a difference too, because you have more weapons for soft balancing. So he has that in mind, and in a way solves his problem, solves the observation, because he says actually balancing is taking place all the time, less or more, some slightly hard, some mostly soft, in the world now. And he's not naive. I like the book, as I've said, because it talks about the conditions under which balancing can take place. But he knows 2 other things. He stresses in the book very properly that the balance of power is, inevitably confused. Is it a description of the way things actually happen naturally, or is it really a normative command to statesmen to act in that way? So he's very well aware of a subtle problem right at the core of his theory. And he knows it doesn't always work. He knows Kant. There's a marvelous image of Kant's when he says, balance of power is like 2 buildings, perfectly balanced, brick by brick, and a sparrow lands on one side, and everything collapses. So he knows that it doesn't work. But in the process of describing really politics since 1945, he gives a marvelous overview with all sorts of details about why China is different in this way and this area and so on. So it's a great introduction to the politics of the last 20 years. I'm going to leave him with a question, because I have 4 minutes. I may have gone past 4 minutes already. Which is that at the end, I have a feeling that he was writing the book, and when he was writing it, he thought soft balancing was doing rather well. But there's a page at the end about Trump. When he first talks about America, the United States, he says, along with a Princeton professor, the United States is open to pressure provided by other states of the world. It's an open state. In the United States, other people can come along and make their voice heard. That was before Trump, and I don't think it was true even then, but it's certainly not true now. So I wonder if that page at the end, when he notes that Trump might be slightly different, I wonder if he sleeps really well at night now. The book's basically an optimistic book, and I think he should be a little bit more troubled now, and I hope he tells us so at the end. Thank you.
Indeed, I think we all feel a little bit more troubled these days, and we'll look forward to hearing about that. So our next speaker is Jennifer Welsh, who's currently a professor and chair in international relations at the European University Institute, but very soon, as of January, she will be the Canada 150 Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill, with a joint appointment in political science in the Max Bell School of Public Policy. So welcome.
Oh, I have to move this down. Yeah. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can't claim to have known TV for a long time because I've only recently just met him. So it's a real pleasure to be able to be here and talk about his book. And as TV knows, our discipline of international relations has a bad reputation for not explaining some of the big systemic changes of the last 40, 50 years, the end of the Cold War, and now why there was no balancing against the United States in the post-Cold War period. And TV's book does an excellent job taking on a central concept from realist international relations theory, the balance of power. I remember when I started taking international relations as an undergraduate, one of my professors said, you know, IR borrows notions from everywhere else. Social theory, power, but there's one thing that's ours, and it's the balance of power. And so I really take my hat off to TV for taking on such an iconic subject in the book. I think it has three strengths, and I want to say a little bit about each of them. I think it advances our theoretical knowledge, I think it's empirically rich, and I think it has historical depth, and all of those things make it a great book. It advances our theoretical knowledge because we understand how and why states soft balance. And he tells us that particularly when rising powers can engage in conquest or threaten others' territorial integrity, they'll use hard balancing. When those conditions aren't present, they'll use soft balancing. But we also understand why they soft balance. And he talks a lot about the contextual factors that make soft balancing possible. And one of them that John Hall mentioned is an era of globalization and interdependence. And finally, he offers up conditions which make soft balancing more or less successful. So when you do it, when are you likely to do it well? And here he makes the interesting observation that it's more likely to succeed if the hegemon you're balancing against cares about legitimacy. And I think that's a very interesting point that comes through the book. I guess my questions about that theoretical paradigm he puts forward is that sometimes it's not always possible to isolate how these factors and conditions work together and which is more important. But also, like our previous speaker, I wonder what will happen when the context changes, when globalization and interdependence are less popular among states, but also when we have a hegemon who cares less about their legitimacy. The second thing I found a strength of the book is that it is empirically very rich. Soft balancing is a term that's thrown around a lot in the literature, but not defined very precisely. And TV offers us a wonderful, crisp definition that can be operationalized. But I also think he could go even further. It was very stimulating for me to think about China in the context of soft balancing and the work that I've done on responsibility to protect. Because I think what we see in recent years is China, through its discourse and its policy, trying to decrease the potential of the United States and its Western allies to change the framework for military intervention, to try to make it more permissive. China has been working against that trend, which would, in a sense, challenge China's own territorial integrity. And to me, it's been an interesting form of soft balancing that we see. Lastly, the strength of the book is that it has historical depth. It's a refreshing corrective to U.S. exceptionalism. The United States from 1990, say, to 2010 is not the sole target of soft balancing. TV shows us in the book lots of historical examples. And unlike what happens in many IR books, history is not used as footnotes. It's actually a rich discussion of the concert of Europe and the 19th century. And I found it particularly rich given all of the work in IR that we're now seeing on the 19th century. It's a big trend in the discipline to talk about the various dimensions of the 19th century. I think most of all, this is a very wise guide to our contemporary era of power politics. On the one hand, TV challenges the Chicken Littles who say every incursion by a Russia or a China is going to mean the breakout of armed conflict, right? He says not necessarily. But on the other hand, he reminds us that we're in a very unpredictable era of systemic change that requires prudent state leaders. So one of the questions the book leaves me with is, what does populism and increased nationalism mean, not just for the pursuit of international cooperation, for trade agreements like NAFTA, for example, but what does it mean for the balance of power and the pursuit of diplomacy in the name of the balance of power? So, highly recommended. It was a pleasure to read.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to pull our next speaker from the audience. Phil, it is your turn. Phil Oxhorn is the Associate Provost Academic at McGill now, in international affairs, but also, and of course, Professor of Political Science and former Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of International Development.
Thank you. So I've also known TB for a long time, as long as he's been at McGill, in fact, and I think I've been here a couple of years longer than him. And one of the things that most impresses me about TB, aside from an exceptionally high level of productivity, is the breadth. So his last book, not the current book, was actually something I'm more familiar with, comparative politics. And it's good to see IR beginning to move into that realm. And I think what we're seeing in his current book is the flip side of that. How balance of power, something that's uniquely IR, can be influenced by comparative politics in important ways. And I think it reminds us that we need to look for continuities. At the same time, we have to begin to appreciate what's different about the period that we're living in. You know, in terms of what the book demonstrates, the history, the detailed, subtle theoretical analysis, the idea of conceptualizing that there are different ways to balance and they're meaningful under different contexts, is something that reminds us that the world may be similar to what it was, even if we don't know that, but it also begins to raise questions that we need to think about. So in many ways, if I may be so bold, the nation state that we typically know is being challenged in a variety of ways. What it means to be a nation is becoming more important, for better or for worse, depending on the context and one's perspective, and its relationship to the state is affected directly by that. In terms of influence, and I guess it would be a kind of soft balance, influence is often more subtle than we ever could have imagined or hoped for. Whether or not China's trying to affect midterm elections in the US, who knows? But we definitely know that the Soviet Union, or Russia is, something that it couldn't have done as the Soviet Union, something that it couldn't have done in the area before social media. And it's these kinds of questions that open up, I think, new opportunities for balance, but it also reminds us that the old kinds of balances and the relations between states are maybe being fundamentally changed as the nature of boundaries between those states are fundamentally changed. And so I think that what I'll just leave TV with the thought of is, like that John Hall's last page. What does Trump really represent? I think that he represents, hopefully, just a blip, keep our fingers crossed. He also represents something else, because that's the real power of Trump, his ability to point out or touch on key points that are of concern to people around the world. We may not like his solutions, but he's connecting with something really real. And with that, just another example from my own personal experience. I had the fortune to listen to a talk by the Premier of China. This was last week. He was talking to the U.S. What he was saying was that China believes in intellectual property, rule of law, free trade, all of the things that sounded more Republican than the current Republican Republican government. And as I was listening to that, I thought, I'm going to Google something. And I realized I couldn't because I was in China. And so there's this real contradiction defending the liberal order, but you can't Google. And it really reminds us that we need to think of things in terms of what was, but how what was may be different because of what is and what's to come. But with that said, it's a really impressive and important book. I think that a lot of people are going to read it because it reminds us that however much the world changes, we need to begin or continue understanding it, at least in terms that we all relate to. balance of power is a particularly useful one. So congratulations.
Thanks, Phil. And now I'd like to introduce you to Marie Lemenche, who's the president of the Canadian International Council's Montreal branch, and also the project coordinator for the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University.
Thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you for coming here. Congratulations. I think it's a wonderful book, and I'm a student of history, but I have a master's in war studies from Queen's College. So I work both in the kind of academic world and in the policy world. And I think that's where your book is important, because it really tries to bridge both worlds. And I think, you know, that's what we do at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We really try to use the research that our fellows do and apply it to policy. We work with governments, we work with the UN, we work with NGOs, and sometimes it can be very long. And Jennifer, I'm pretty sure you're used to working with the UN, so how slow things can be on genocide prevention and conflict prevention. So I was very interested in your book, particularly your approach to the importance of institutions. And my biggest worry right now, you know, there is the UN General Assembly going on right now, and so you hear people like Donald Trump speaking about the ICC, for example, and completely denigrating it. And that's what got me worried when I listened to all the speeches. But then your book, you know, it's still optimistic, and I'm not used to reading optimistic book these days. So I found it kind of refreshing. Even though, you know, I was reading some of the pages 2 days ago while listening to Donald Trump at the UN. So I really encourage you to read it, because I think whether you're an academic, a professor, or if you want to learn more about policy, I think the book is very interesting and enlightening. And there are 2 quotes that I actually noted down that I really found interesting, that I think highlight what the book is about. Important for the future is how much value great powers accord to the norms of principles of international institutions and legitimacy of non-military mechanisms. The functioning of balance of power is dependent on the international politics of the day, capability for configurations, and how leading statesmen operate strategically. So I think where your book is interesting really is that theory that you bring, but you bring it to the real world, and that's why I'm thankful for, because it's sometimes hard to bridge the academic and the policy world. So thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to introduce the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Antonia Maioni, also from the Department of Political Science, who will then introduce the man of the hour, TV Paul.
I realize I'm between you and the man of the hour, but I did want to take this occasion to be here on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and to introduce our esteemed colleague, T.V. Paul, who is a James McGill Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science. And even though I am here also to congratulate you, T.V., on the publication of this book, it's not your first book, and it certainly won't be your last. So we're very happy to be able to be here celebrating with you. But you know, a book is also the product of the person who writes it. And we should understand that Professor T.V. Paul has such an accomplished and interesting background as well. We interviewed him recently for the Faculty of Arts, and what we learned is that his deep interest in current affairs began at a very early age, reading newspapers, listening to the BBC. He was a child of his time, a child during the time of the Vietnam War and the nuclear arms race. So for him, this idea of being immersed in history is very real. American bombings in Vietnam were happening as he grew up. The issue of arms control was being debated regularly in the news. So after completing his undergraduate degree at Kerala University in India, he went on to do a PhD in political science and international relations at UCLA. Here, his passion for international relations and foreign policy was sustained by his experience as a journalist for a national agency in New Delhi and all of his international travels. He was so international that he left the United States for Canada, and we were so happy that he chose McGill in Montreal as his home, where he's been a member of the McGill community since 1991. But Professor Paul is not just a good citizen of McGill University, he's also a very engaged citizen of his own discipline and of the community of scholars who are devoted to the study of international relations. He is a recipient of the Peace Scholar Award from the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 1989, he served as president of the International Studies Association. He's a founding director of the McGill University Université de Montréal Center for International Peace and Security Studies, which Professor Welsh will now be taking on in January. And most recently, we were very proud to announce that Professor Paul was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Congratulations again to you. Professor Paul's crucial work here focuses on many puzzles and paradox in international relations, as the speakers have told you. I'm not an expert in this field, though I do have a master's in international relations, but I found it a little too complex and paradoxical, perhaps. But I do want you to remember that this book is part of, I think, a trajectory of study and scholarship in which his work has had a significant impact on the development of policy in the areas of peace building, security planning, and nuclear arms control. And we are very, very proud to have Professor Paul as an esteemed member of our department in our faculty, and I want to congratulate him again on the publication of the book.
It's really an honor to be with you today, and I'm very grateful that the Dean of Arts and my colleagues are here, and a number of my friends and students. I won't take too long. I'll just try to raise a few points. One is, when I was writing the book, Trump was not in the picture, so I had to add a few pages at the end, which was a little bit challenging, and Trump was just starting the administration. But when I look at Trump, he represents a phenomenon that many of you know. Carl Polanyi talks about in his great book, The Great Transformation, which is a history of double movements. You have this period of openness, period of institution building, trade, free trade, etc. Then it comes contraction. The United States without institutions will decline much faster than it is now. The institutions are the core of American liberal order that it created in the post-war period. Luckily, as it was mentioned here, the rising powers are not going to give up institutions. They may create their own, they may try to develop new ones, improve it. So my sense is Trump is a passing phenomenon. He will go. The Americans are reasonably sensible people. By the way, they elected Obama of all people. So it is interesting to see that the American electorate is sensitive to legitimacy, and that's one of the things I argue in the book, that Bush destroyed that legitimacy, but Obama was arguing that we need our legitimacy back. We need to get the world support, and this is still possible, but economic conditions can derail quite a bit. Globalization's negative impact we are seeing slowly because the liberals did not pay attention to income distribution at all. It is a big mistake compared to the previous liberals who managed to have the Great Society idea, a number of ideas to solve the collective action problems that capitalism brings in. The second part about China, where is China going? I'm a fan of China, at least that part of China that says peaceful rise. China learned from previous mistakes of rising powers. One of the things the Chinese did was to avoid this problem of war in that process. So this book is an effort in my effort to create what you call an eclectic IR or international relations. As you will notice that I'm borrowing ideas from realism, in liberalism and constructivism. And people claim that I'm kind of taking everybody's ideas. But this is what I think is needed for understanding the big puzzles of the day. Those who are not international relations scholars here probably won't know our discipline is divided among different ideological or theoretical perspectives. And my effort is to bridge this as a bridge building exercise. So for that reason alone, I think some people may disagree with me. But I'm happy that I did that, because if senior scholars don't do that, the younger scholars are now forced to pigeonhole themselves and engage in this sort of parallel tracks or competing tracks. But I hope that this book will encourage our younger scholars in particular in the regions and try to come up with new ideas, testing the arguments, and policymakers, which I think are starting to look at in Washington. I'm going to Carnegie International Council to give a talk, various places. Hopefully they will pay attention. And by the way, America is not Trump alone. The State Department, there is all kinds of diplomatic world out there looking for ideas like this to resurrect their kind of liberal order. So I have a feeling that we are passing through this cycle. And this cycle hopefully will pass fast and we return to a better liberal order. Not that I'm a big fan of liberal order, but I think that is a better world than everything else I can see. Therefore, an improved, a nice world that we can work on, but don't lose hope. Thank you.